Hi, I'm Jill Johnson, CEO of the Institute for Entrepreneurial Leadership and Workshop and Business Opportunities. Many of you know us best for the entrepreneurial training and mentoring and ongoing support that we provide. What you may not know is that we have a special outreach effort targeting the reentry population, or those who have been formerly incarcerated. The opportunities to find gainful employment and economic opportunities are limited, few and far between. And we had the opportunity to speak with Piper Kerman, author of Orange is the New Black, which is being turned into a Netflix series. The book details her experience in the federal prison system. And one thing that really jumped out at us as we read the book is the lack of opportunity for people to get training that leads to economic self-sufficiency upon release. Well, this is where WIBO comes in. We have a tremendous opportunity to expand our reach and to create tremendous impact for people that otherwise have limited opportunity. So let's hear more about what Piper has to say. Piper, this is so exciting about your book being made into a
TV series.
A TV series on Netflix. Are you excited?
I'm very, very excited about the adaptation of the book into a television series. And it's really exciting to be part of Netflix, which is this sort of new, innovative way of delivering stories to audiences. So that's very cool.
And as we talk, I don't want to give away any of the highlights of the show or anything like that, but I really want to talk about what you found when you were in prison, because I'm sure that there are many people who have one notion of how it is, and you actually got to experience that firsthand, and you were probably a very unlikely candidate to be there in the first place, according to some people.
I think that is one of the things that brings some audiences to the book, is this idea of a fish out of water. We have really specific ideas about who's in prison and why they're there. My own experience, was very different than I think common perception about who's in prison, why they're there, and also what happens to them when they are behind bars. And so that's one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book, because I think the reality is much more complex and frankly much more interesting than conventional wisdom about prisons and prisoners.
Now, give us just a little taste of what your life was like before you went to prison, and give us just a little hint of sort of how you ended up there.
Before I went to prison, in my 20s and 30s, I was much like, any other sort of working professional. I worked in communications. I worked for a production company for a while in California. I worked as a creative director for web services firms that built websites and did online marketing. And that was really interesting, dynamic work. I was sent to prison for a 10-year-old offense, something that had happened when I was in my very early 20s. And a lot of people, young people, get in trouble because they don't really understand the consequences of their actions very completely, either the consequences for themselves or the impact that their actions have on other people. Unfortunately, the way the criminal justice system works, sometimes folks are sent to prison for very long periods of time for nonviolent offenses. And that takes them out of their community. It takes them out of productive, mainstream work. And there's very little that's happening behind bars to ready someone to go back to their community and back to society. And specifically, one of the biggest concerns is, how are folks going to take care of themselves? How are they going to provide for themselves and sometimes their families when they come home? So, for me, I had a really well-established professional career and a big skill set that I was still going to be able to draw on. And I also had an education to fall back on. You can never take someone's education away from them, no matter how long they might be locked up. So I was very, very fortunate in that respect. The other thing I had to draw on was a network, a network of friends, of families, of former colleagues who were still, standing by me.
A very strong support system from your family and friends.
Exactly, but not only my family and friends, also, my former coworkers, were really wonderful. So when I was sentenced, for example, like many former coworkers wrote letters to my judge of support. And when I came home from prison, those relationships still held strong. So those things were really, really important in terms of my success coming home, just simple success of, being able to complete my probation and, being able to
getting a job,
exactly, and just, staying on the straight and narrow.
Right. So talk about how that's different from what you saw from most of your fellow inmates that were there.
Yeah. So one of the things that was most important when I was in prison was the recognition that the things that I had in common with the other women who I was locked up with were much more important than the things that made us different. But there were really important differences. I had a really good education, a public, high school education, and then a private college education to draw upon. I had, long-standing professional experience that I could draw upon, even if I wasn't going to do the same kind of work when I came home from prison. The majority of people who are in prison in this country lack even a high school diploma. So GED programs are frequently required in prison.
Required, but sometimes not available. And you mentioned in the book, poorly staffed. And
required, but not always available, or not always very good.
Right.
So, that educational piece has really been missing for a lot of folks who are in the criminal justice system. And that was a really big difference between me and many other women, is that they had not had as many educational opportunities as I have had in my life. The other truth is that a huge number of people in prison, are there because of the, underground economies or informal economies. Whether you're talking about, the drug trade, the illegal drug trade, or, a variety of other things.
And often due to the fact that they don't have skills and other opportunities to earn a livable wage.
Exactly, right. So when they come home from prison, it's very clear that they need to be able to live a law-abiding life in order to avoid going back. But the pathways and the skills to get the kind of work that is going to make it possible for them to support themselves and often to support their families, those things are not so clear cut.
Well, I think your book does an amazing job of pointing out that it really is a vicious cycle, and what comes out is usually what goes in with a little bit taken away, or something. There's something that's not there when you come out, and so if you're lucky, you're able to somewhat go back to the skills and rely on the skills that you had, but there's a little bit of an edge there that you have to try to get over.
Well, not only have folks lost the time, so let's say someone gets sent to prison for 10 years, there's all kinds of things that happen on the outside world. The world keeps moving forward, and folks sort of lose that time.
You mentioned people who were in there who, when they went in, there were no cell phones or things that would come out.
Right, exactly. So really, literally, there would be women who would be really nervous about email and computers and cell phones even, because those things were not things that they were familiar with when they were sent to prison. So for one thing, there's the lost time, but also there are very formidable formal barriers to people who come home from prison and for jail, in terms of prohibitions against where they can live and their freedom of movement even after they've completed their sentence, and things like employment are very, very formidable stumbling blocks.
Let's turn for a minute to what it is that is accessible to people when they're in prison. There are some folks out there who think that they are supporting people in prison and they are going to the gym all day and living this in a lap of luxury, and why should our tax dollars go to support these people who have done a wrong against society? And your book points out that it's not like that. And certainly when you go to the, I think you mentioned county level correctional facilities or the local facilities when you were in Chicago, that there were really no resources and nothing for people to do there. Just talk about that a little bit, and what what they're actually getting, what they have, the resources to which they have access in order to try to prepare themselves for the outside world.
Right. Life in prison is a life of scarcity. So I think that there is a perception sometimes that there is a lot of rehabilitative programming that takes place behind prison walls. My own experience is that that is rarely the case. So in my experience, for example, you know, in Danbury, you know, a typical day would include a 6 a.m. wake-up call, and at 7 a.m., you know, after breakfast, you would head to your prison job. These jobs were typically, you know, manual labor, so it's a prison full of women.
And which not everyone could get, right?
Well,
you had to have a waiting period to get the job?
It varied, it depended. Some of the jobs that were most desirable included, you know, jobs that had a higher skill set. Those were actually very hard to get. But most of the jobs were things like, you know, working as an orderly, cleaning the buildings. I worked as an electrician and as a construction worker. And, you know, here's the thing. I learned a lot in the course of that work. Not that transferable or valuable, actually, in terms of me coming home. So it's great that women, you know, were potentially learning how to be plumbers and how to be construction workers and how to be electricians, because the prisoners do all of the maintenance of the prisons. But in the case of female prisoners, as an example, there's a certain lack of likelihood that they will go back home and do those jobs.
And join the union, let's say.
Right, and there's certainly no formal relationships, for example, with the union to guide those women towards those jobs.
Right.
So there was no workforce development or work skill development that took place within the federal system that I saw at all.
Right.
That doesn't mean it doesn't happen in any prison, but it certainly doesn't happen the way that some folks imagine.
And you were asked oftentimes if you could read. People would say, can you read?
Yes.
And so you would be put on certain jobs because you could read. But again, if someone is going in without high reading levels and high skills, they were almost relegated to certain positions even within the prison system.
Cleaning toilets, yes.
Which then leads to, what do you do with that when you exit?
Yeah, in the electric shop, you know, the prison guard who ran the electric shop said, you know, oh, can you read? You seem to be the most educated amongst the group. You read the manual. Go figure out how to be an electrician.
Right.
You know, I got a couple shocks.
I was going to say.
Yeah. But yes, there is nothing systemic that is focused on getting folks ready to come home and make changes in their lives. And I think that is one of the biggest misperceptions about prison.
Now, would you say that the people with whom you were incarcerated wanted more? Were they hungry for more education and information, and given the opportunity, do you think that they would take advantage of more programming?
Absolutely, and I think that if it comes to pass that someone is incarcerated, the period while they are incarcerated is this incredible moment of opportunity in a strange way, because nobody in prison is like, oh, I'm going to go home and come back here. Everyone in prison is thinking about how they cannot come back there ever again. But what doesn't happen typically is any opportunity for them to start translating that into real change that they can then carry home with them when they walk through prison gates. So I think that there is definitely a real hunger for opportunities for folks to make change in their lives.
And it was very clear that some of your fellow inmates did not have a support system, so they weren't getting the visitors on the weekends.
Absolutely.
They weren't making phone calls to friends and family. They weren't getting people sending lots of books to them to read. So you became, I guess, the de facto library there.
Yeah, that is definitely true. So some folks are perhaps isolated and that contributes to their crime and their offense. But that's not true for everyone who is in prison. Unfortunately, what happens is that the way that the system works it also puts formidable barriers to folks having continued contact with the outside world, which has been proven to be a really big factor in making sure that folks don't re-offend when they come home. So prisoners who have a lot of contact with their family or with volunteers from the outside world, are able to make phone calls and have, letters and so on and so forth, those folks are far less likely to go back to prison than people who are isolated during their experience.
And is that, in your opinion, because if you are isolated in prison, that really becomes your reality?
Absolutely, yes. And, when you are isolated from other people and you have no network, again, of friends or family or other folks who you can weave yourself back into, when you go home, you remain isolated.
Right. You talk about people leaving and going to homeless shelters, or really when they step through that door, they have no clue where they're going.
Yeah, there were a lot of women who would be, their release date would be approaching, and they would be getting more and more nervous and scared because they had nowhere to go. And they were heading out to, ironically, an even more uncertain future than their life behind bars. It's really tragic.
So let's turn the conversation for a minute to something that's near and dear to our hearts, which is entrepreneurship, and how entrepreneurship really could play a role in the lives of many of these women. I think from two perspectives. One, something for them to do themselves and to create self-employment. But on the flip side, as was your case, there was an entrepreneur who was instrumental in essentially giving you a job. And so when you own a business, you have the ability to provide jobs for people who are near and dear to you who may be coming from this situation.
Absolutely. So I often reflected while I was in prison on the irony of these barriers to folks having really productive legal work when they go home. Women are so entrepreneurial. Women start businesses at such a remarkable rate.
And you all were so resourceful.
And are so resourceful.
In prison.
Right, and yes. And so one of the fascinating things that I observed, of course there's an economy within prison walls. There are informal economies. And what you saw women doing who had no resources coming in from the outside, they might come from very poor families, or they might, have very limited contact with the outside world sometimes, is that they would start these informal prison businesses, doing things like giving pedicures, or, if they were handy with a needle and thread, fixing other people's uniforms. There was a woman who, would iron and press other people's uniforms in exchange for commissary.
Well, they're crocheting and
exactly.
knitting.
Crocheting, knitting, a whole range. So, come Christmas time, like women who are really handy with a crochet needle would make toys and stuffed bears and so on and so forth for other women who wanted to send them home to their kids.
All the hair that was being done.
Hair that was being done. So there's all kinds of interesting entrepreneurial, transactional, things going on. Nothing sort of to formalize that, nothing to sort of draw out those skills and help that folks shape them and really think about how those are going to apply when they go back home, unfortunately. But, it's there. Like, that entrepreneurial spirit is there, absolutely. And when I came home, I had, an education and a professional history upon which to draw, but I also had an incredible thing which very few prisoners have, and that is someone on the outside who was willing to give me a chance. And so Dan Hoffman, who was running a voice-over-IP phone company.
Our board chair.
Yes, he created a marketing job within the company that he was running, and welcomed me, and his other employees welcomed me, and that was huge. That was a very humbling and really, really important opportunity for me. And I can't overstate how rare that is for people coming home from prison and jail.
And you were able to get a job as a marketing professional where people that are even just trying to get jobs doing labor types of positions have difficulty because they have to check a box that they have had some prior offense.
Yeah, well, this is really the difference between folks who have a network into which they can lean and which they can rely on, and folks who are out there just trying to find a job in the most simple of ways, and that the box which you refer to, do you have a conviction on your record, is one of the most formidable barriers to people coming home from prison and jail successfully.
Mm-hmm. We talked about the time that people have in prison, and that's a time to really, make a change. Mm-hmm. The fact that they have entrepreneurial interests mm-hmm. and attributes. What is it that you think is stopping there from being more programming?
I think that one of the things that stops there being programming and opportunities that tap into this potential, this sort of hidden potential, is that truthfully there's not much incentive for prisons or jails to create that programming on their own. So they really need outside partners who can help them do that, because they don't view, the people who run prisons and jails do not view this as central to what they need to get done. Mm-hmm. So it's really, really important that other folks sort of lean into that opportunity and build their kind of relationships with prisons, with jails, with probation and parole systems, mm-hmm. because those folks are really the gatekeepers who can help facilitate, the kind of change that we really could see. Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the opportunity for creating that change would be while they're still in prison, so that when they leave, they actually have the skills.
Absolutely. I once participated in a meeting, and there were a number of former prisoners participating in this meeting as well, and we talked about reentry a great deal. And a guy who had been in prison said, if you start reentry at the gate, it's too late. Mm-hmm. The reentry process, or thinking really in a concrete, strategic and literal way about reentry, should happen, frankly, on the day someone walks into prison. Mm-hmm. Every single day that you're in prison should be spent planning for getting out.
Mm-hmm. And it would seem that with someone having a dream of starting a business mm-hmm. and a vision, and they're actually working toward that by developing a plan while they're still there, would actually even give them some hope, something to live for, something to help them, bide their time and check off those days until they're released.
Absolutely. And also, that's a huge incentive for, good behavior and for doing all the things that, we expect folks to do when they are serving a sentence. Mm-hmm. And that hope is really essential. Like, folks need to believe that it's really possible for them to change their lives and for them to succeed. That couldn't be more critical.
Well, we're certainly hoping that WIBO can continue to play a role in that aspect. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of programming, and we provide actually scholarships mm-hmm. for people that were formerly incarcerated. Mm-hmm. We're hoping that we can expand our reach into the actual prisons, so that we're giving people that type of hope and the training and the skills mm-hmm. that they need to be able to start and grow successful businesses once they leave. Mm-hmm. So we're looking forward to expanding that. We hope that we find outside partners who are willing to support that financially, because mm-hmm. there's not a lot of support there, as you've seen and pointed out in your book, from the existing government resources. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I think that's really important. I think that it's important for folks to understand that the correctional systems themselves really view their responsibility as running confinement, mm-hmm. and they don't view rehabilitative programs or services as part of their responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so, other folks need to step up on that, because correction systems are not doing it on their own.
Piper, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for bringing light and attention to this really important and critical social issue. And we just hope that we can do our very small part to make a difference in the lives of women who are returning home.
Oh, Jill, the work that WIBO does is so important, and it is, again, a group and a population of people who, are hungry for change and really need it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We hope that you enjoyed this conversation and learned something in the process. We hope that you will support us in making a difference for people who are trying to change their lives through entrepreneurship. Thank you so much for being with us.